Welcome back to Grimverse History, where we uncover the strange and forgotten sides of history. Tonight's story reveals what truly happened when Viking violence met sacred silence at Lindisfarne. We're told the Vikings respected holy places, that monasteries were spared, but there was one thing the raiders valued more than gold. The most sacred island in England fell in a single morning. You open a wooden door worn smooth by prayer. Cold air slips inside, carrying salt from the sea. If you enjoy drifting through history like this, consider liking the video, subscribing, and turning on notifications. Now, take a slow breath. Let the noise of your day fade away. It's the year 793. The island of Lindisfarne rests between mist and sea, untouched by war. You're standing on the cliffs of Holy Island, watching the sunrise over the North Sea. Your name is Sister Hild. You're 23 years old. For the past 6 years, this monastery has been your entire world. Prayer, manuscripts, silence, safety. Around you, the other sisters are beginning morning prayers. There are 31 nuns in the monastery, 47 monks, against perhaps 200 raiders. The mathematics of this moment are brutal. Here's what you need to understand about Viking raiding strategy in 793. This wasn't random violence. The Lindisfarne raid was the product of careful reconnaissance. Norwegian scouts had been mapping the Northumbrian coast for months, identifying wealthy, undefended targets. Monasteries were perfect, isolated, rich, pacifist. The Vikings reached the monastery doors within minutes. The wooden bars that protected against wolves and storms don't stand against men who spend their lives breaking shield walls. The doors shatter. Think about what happened psychologically in this moment. Your sister, Hild. You've spent 6 years in prayer and contemplation. The most violent thing you've witnessed was a disagreement over copying technique. Now men with axes are flooding into your sanctuary. The first monk who tries to resist, Brother Cuthbert, 62 years old, holding a wooden crucifix like a weapon, is cut down before he can speak. The axe stroke nearly severs his head. The blood spatters across the stone floor where you've knelt in prayer every morning for 6 years. This is your introduction to Viking warfare. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the primary contemporary source, the Vikings' first objective was systematic intimidation. They didn't immediately kill everyone. That would be wasteful. They needed information. Where are the treasures? Where are the relics? Where is the gold? The monks who resist are killed immediately, their bodies left where they fall as demonstration. But the sisters and younger monks are gathered, herded like livestock into the church itself. You're kneeling on cold stone around you. 31 sisters and perhaps 20 surviving monks. The Vikings are speaking a language you've never heard. Harsh guttural. Nothing like the Latin you've spent years learning. One of the raiders, massive, his beard braided with silver rings, is clearly in command. Years later, Viking sagas would suggest this was likely Jarl Sigfred, though the name is disputed. He walks among you slowly, examining faces, occasionally pointing. When he points at Sister Elwith, the eldest, 2 raiders drag her to the altar. This is where the systematic horror begins. Here's what archaeological evidence and later Viking raid patterns tell us about their interrogation methods. Vikings had learned that Christian clergy would often die rather than reveal sacred hiding places. They'd witnessed martyrdom, seen monks accept death willingly, so they didn't threaten the monks with death. They threatened the sisters. The Viking leader speaks. His words are incomprehensible to you. But Brother Edred, who survived and later wrote an account now housed in the British Library, understood the meaning clearly. Tell us whether the treasures are hidden, or we will show what happens to those who protect secrets. Sister Alswith, brave and old, spits at the Viking leader's feet. The demonstration begins. The Vikings drag Sister Alswith to the altar itself. The symbolism is calculated. The most sacred place in the monastery is chosen deliberately, not for speed, but for message. What follows is not described in detail by those who survived, only that she was publicly humiliated. That force was applied again and again, that the process was slow, deliberate, and meant to be understood by everyone watching. The other sisters are not allowed to look away. They are held in place. They are made to witness what resistance leads to. Time loses its meaning in that space. After long minutes that feel endless, Brother Edred breaks. He speaks not out of fear for himself, but to make the suffering stop. He reveals the location of the treasury beneath the crypts. Only then does the violence end. Sister Alswit dies hours later from the injuries she sustained. She is left where she lies, on the same altar where she had received communion hundreds of times. This is the Vikings' opening statement. Not rage, not chaos, a lesson. Resistance has a cost, and the treasury is only the beginning. What makes the Lindisfarne raid linger in history is not speed but duration. This was not a momentary strike. The raiders remained day after day. For 3 long days the island was held in suspension. Time stretched, routine dissolved. Everything the monastery had accumulated over generations was slowly dismantled. Objects, spaces. Those who survived the first hours were quietly separated, not by names or vows, but by usefulness. Some were deemed unable to continue, others were marked for labor. A few, simply because of youth, were allowed to remain standing. Brother Edred endured because he could still work. Younger monks were kept, not as people, but as potential value. The sisters were observed in the same manner, by age, by strength, by appearance. You, Sister Hild, 23 years old, still strong enough to be noticed in the logic of raiding cultures. Human lives could be repurposed into labor, into status, into trade. Sometimes all at once, the monastery itself was emptied piece by piece. Sacred vessels, decorated reliquaries, jewels lifted from illuminated pages, the texts were left behind. Their meaning unread, their words scattered by wind and feet. Centuries of careful learning dissolved into silence. As night fell, the great hall filled again, not with prayer, but with unfamiliar voices. Those who remained were brought forward to serve, to move, to obey. Hierarchy asserted itself quietly. Some sisters retreated inward. Speech faded, awareness dimmed. One chose absence instead of endurance. The sea closed over her story. What followed over the next days was not recorded in detail. Only that time passed, and something within the sisters was altered permanently. On the morning of the 4th day, June 11th, in the year 793 after Christ, the Vikings began preparing to leave Lindisfarne. But departure did not mean release. Their longships were built for speed, not mercy. Space was limited, carefully calculated, and everybody taken aboard meant less room for silver, relics, and weapons. Yet human lives also carried value, especially in Scandinavian ports and along trade routes that reached deep into the Islamic world. Healthy young women in particular could be exchanged for sums large enough to justify the sacrifice of cargo space. All surviving sisters and the younger monks were driven into the monastery courtyard. There, beneath the open sky, the final decisions were made. The selection was methodical rather than cruel in appearance. Faces were studied, teeth examined, bodies assessed for strength, illness, or weakness, with the detached efficiency of a market inspection rather than a battlefield judgment. Sister Quenbur, the abbess, 48 years old, stepped forward despite her age and exhaustion. She tried to place herself between the warriors and the younger sisters, still clinging to the authority of her vows. She was struck down, not as an enemy, but as an inconvenience. Left in the courtyard, barely conscious, she was no longer considered worth the space aboard a ship. Out of 31 sisters, 12 were chosen not by faith, not by character, but by youth, health, and perceived value. You, Sister Hild, at 23 you were among them. This choice carried no desire, no intention of care. You were not selected because you were wanted. You were selected because you could be traded. Those left behind wept not with relief, but with understanding. Many knew that what awaited the chosen might be slower, longer, and more uncertain than death itself. Some resisted instinctively, others had to be pulled away. Brother Osric, 24 years old, fought against being taken, driven by fear rather than strength. His resistance ended quickly, and he was carried toward the ships like the rest. At high tide, the longships pushed away from shore. Behind them, smoke rose as wooden buildings were set alight. Only the stone church remained, standing amid ash and ruin. The voyage north lasted nearly 2 weeks. Below-deck captives endured cold spray, darkness, and hunger, given only what was necessary to keep them alive. You were merchandised now. Survival was the objective. Comfort was irrelevant. By the time the ships reached Norway, not all who had been taken were still breathing. Some wounds lingered unseen. Some minds simply withdrew. You survived. Salt clung to your skin. Your thoughts retreated somewhere distant, somewhere untouched by the sea, the chains, or the ship beneath you. The Vikings operated sophisticated slave networks. Captives from Britain and Ireland were valuable commodities. Christian captives were considered exotic in pagan Scandinavia. They were especially prized along trade routes that extended into the Islamic world. When the ships docked at a Norwegian port, likely Kopang, based on the time frame, the surviving captives were unloaded. You can barely stand. The Vikings pull you from the ship. They force you to walk through the town. People stare, Norse women, children, merchants. You are no longer a person. You are proof of a successful raid. A Christian nun in torn robes moving through a pagan settlement. The slave market is organized, efficient, routine. Scandinavian slave trading is a major economic force. In some regions, enslaved people make up a significant portion of the population. The sisters from Lindisfarne are examined, judged, sold. Some are purchased by wealthy households. They cook, clean, weave, they do whatever is demanded of them. Others are sent to farms, places where survival is uncertain, where there are no legal protections. Under Viking law, enslaved people have no standing. They can be punished or killed without consequence. The youngest and most physically desirable are taken for another purpose. Viking law distinguishes between wives, concubines, and enslaved concubines. Those in the last category have no rights, no protection, no future. Some are sold onward to long-distance traders, carried toward markets as far as Constantinople or Baghdad. Your sister Hild, a Norse trader, examines you as property. He inspects your teeth, your hair. He makes you walk to judge your condition. He pays the Viking jarl in silver. You are worth about 12 ounces, a considerable sum, but still less than a well-made sword. You are chained with 4 other women, none of them from Lindisfarne, all taken in different raids, a line of captives moving south. This is where the historical record loses most of the Lindisfarne sisters. No names, no endings, only disappearance into the machinery of the Viking Age slave trade. Some convert under pressure, renouncing faith sometimes brings marginally better treatment. A few are ransomed years later, sometimes decades later. If they survive long enough to be found, most do not. They die enslaved, buried without markers, or not buried at all. A very small number escape. Their accounts are traumatized. One such account, possibly from a Lindisfarne survivor, though the identification is disputed, appears in a manuscript at Durham Cathedral. The woman is unnamed. She describes being sold multiple times over 7 years, moved between owners, enduring constant deprivation, eventually abandoned when she is no longer considered useful. She returns to England, lives another 12 years. She dies of what the chronicler calls a wasting illness, likely the long-term result of untreated injury and disease. She is approximately 32 years old when she dies. It announced their presence, it demonstrated their capabilities, and most importantly, it created a weapon more effective than any army after Lindisfarne, a phrase spread across Christian Europe. A furor Normanorum libera nos Domini. From the fury of the Northmen deliver us, O Lord. It became a common prayer. Monasteries that had stood undefended for centuries began to build walls. Fortifications appeared where none had been needed before. Guards were posted. Coastal communities lived in constant fear. The sight of ships on the horizon caused panic. Entire villages were abandoned as people fled inland. The Vikings had weaponized reputation. Often they could extract tribute simply by appearing. The memory of Lindisfarne arrived before them. But the sisters of Lindisfarne were not warriors. They were not political actors. They were not wealthy nobles held for ransom. They were women who had chosen lives of prayer and scholarship. They illuminated manuscripts, they grew herbs, they sang hymns, and they were destroyed spiritually, psychologically, physically, not because of who they were, but because of where they were and what they represented. The Viking warriors who raided Lindisfarne were not monsters in a fairy tale sense. They were rational actors within a culture that valued martial success and profitable raiding. The treatment of captives followed established norms. It was systematic, calculated, accepted within their world. That is what makes it more disturbing. This was not chaos. It was policy. The raid on Lindisfarne marked the beginning of the Viking Age, roughly from 793 to 1066 after Christ, nearly 3 centuries of raiding, trading, enslavement. Across Europe into Russia and beyond, thousands of monasteries were attacked. Tens of thousands of people were taken. How many sisters? How many brothers? How many monks and nuns endured what the Lindisfarne community endured? We do not know. The historical record rarely counts victims, especially female victims, especially those who were conquered, enslaved, and erased. What evidence remains suggests a pattern first seen at Lindisfarne: terror used deliberately, human trafficking as an economic engine, repeated again and again. Archaeology continues to uncover the scale: mass graves, slave quarters, trading centers organized around human property. In 2017, excavations at a site in Denmark revealed what archaeologists identified as a slave market compound. Carbon dating placed its use roughly between 850 and 900 after Christ. Evidence suggested hundreds of captives passed through the site over decades. How many were Christian clergy? How many were women like Hild, like Edith, like Alswith? We will never know their names. The monastery at Lindisfarne was rebuilt decades later, but it was never the same. The library was gone, the treasures scattered, the community of scholars destroyed. Of the 31 sisters who stood on the cliffs that morning watching the sun rise, perhaps 3 ever saw England again. The rest vanished, absorbed into the vast and silent machinery of the Viking slave networks. The journey is slowing now. Somewhere in memory you can still hear it. Wind moving across cold stone, a bell echoing faintly, a monastery standing in ash, footprints fading in wet sand, voices that were never written down. The sisters of Lindisfarne do not return to us as heroes. They return as echoes, as questions history never learned how to answer. If this story stayed with you, even quietly, you may rest your hand on the like button or share the channel with someone who listens at night. Subscribing helps these stories continue their slow work. Goodbye, and we will meet again.